Time to turn to this question. Who on earth is going to lead the IMF? And it's a question with a little more urgency this morning after U.S. Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner said it's time to appoint an interim leader at the least, and Dominique Strauss-Kahn is, quote, obviously not in a position to run the IMF, but who? With us to answer the question, renowned historian and Princeton University professor Harold James. His latest book is entitled The Creation and Destruction of Value, the Globalization Cycle. Professor James, good morning to you. Let's talk about the kind of person that ought to be running the IMF as opposed to who it should be. We'll get to that in a moment.
In the past, there was always a tradition, it's not a formal rule, that there should be a European at the head of the IMF. But that seems to me to be a tradition whose time has now come to an end.
So who instead, if not a European?
I think somebody from a strong emerging market is the obvious choice to do this at the
So you would lend your support to the calls that we've heard from South Africa, for example, and rumblings from China that effectively make the same case, that it is time to dispense with tradition and recognize the shift in economic power to emerging markets that has taken place over the past decade?
That's absolutely right. And there's an additional factor. Some people are saying because there's a euro crisis at the moment, you need a European to deal with that. But that's precisely wrong. The whole philosophy of the fund is that you get somebody who has an outside vision to manage crises. After all, in the Asian crisis in the 1990s, there wasn't an Asian running the fund either.
No, and Neil Ferguson of Harvard was on with us this morning, another historian, talking about taking exactly the opposite view, why it needs to be a European right now, because the situation in Europe is so fragile. And I guess the point that Neil was trying to make, and I'm interested in your opinion on this, is that because of the fragility in Europe, it would be a mistake to bring in somebody from the outside who doesn't have familiarity with the economic history, with the political tensions and the sensitivities. You don't see that as a problem?
No, not at all. You often need an outside view in exactly these kind of situations. And the other thing is that the Europeans obviously have European mechanisms for dealing with these issues. They have the European Union. But in this particular case, those European mechanisms have not worked out properly, and you need this international perspective. And an outsider, I think, brings that international perspective best and most effective.
Professor, let's talk about some of the potential outsiders. If it's not going to be Christine Lagarde, whom some have mooted as a potential successor to Dominique Strauss-Kahn, or Gordon Brown, whom we know very badly wants the job, the former British Prime Minister, who might it be? The Turkish finance minister, as you may know, Mehmet Şimşek, said, quote, yesterday, "I don't have even the tiniest shortage in terms of experience or knowledge," very directly throwing his hat into the ring. Is he a legitimate candidate? Should Turkey be the country, to supply the next IMF leader?
I think it's conceivable that Turkey could supply the next IMF leader, or Brazil. But actually, I would prefer somebody who is really technically qualified and knows the fund from the inside. It seems to me there's a very, very strong candidate in Mohamed ElErian.
Mohamed ElErian, but Mohamed ElErian has, he did it right here on Bloomberg television yesterday, and subsequently in a piece in the Financial Times, taken himself out of the running. Do you think he's just playing coy, or is he a legitimate candidate?
I don't know that, obviously, but it seems to me that that's exactly the kind of candidate who would be most appropriate. There are actually, I mean, maybe you would also want to consider people who are in some sense European, but not in the West European core. People from Eastern Europe. I think the claims of some of the East European emerging market economies is very strong. You could think of Marek Belka from Poland, or if you want to go further back, a great figure who stabilized the post-communist economy, Leszek Balcerowicz.
How about someone from China, perhaps, or India? You mentioned Turkey, you mentioned Brazil, you just mentioned Eastern Europe. We haven't heard China or India come up.
Those are absolutely also really very viable countries. I mean, I think the problem with one of the very big emerging market countries, and China is the most obvious one, is that you would then see something of a kind of polarization between China and the United States, and it may be that it's better to have somebody who can stand as a more distant arbitrator in that kind of dispute.
Professor, when you say the next IMF leader needs to be more technically competent, what exactly do you mean? What kind of a background does this person need to have?
They really need to be a high-profile economist. I think the past experience of having people with a strong political background hasn't actually worked all that well. It lays the position open to all kinds of possible problems. I mean, one of them is that high-profile political people often want to go back into national politics. This was the case with Mr. Strauss-Kahn even before this scandal.
All right, Professor, thank you so much for joining us. Professor Harold James of Princeton University making a very strong case for the need for dramatic change at the top of the IMF.